So we're back yet again with Greg Selch. Greg, I have to tell you, I am absolutely enjoying these episodes that I'm doing with you, and I have personally learned so much about vintage watches.
I'm very, very glad to hear it. I've had a good time as well.
Thank you. So we've learned about what vintage watches are. We've learned about how to maintain them, how to collect them. Um, Today, I'd like to talk to you about watches, vintage watches that haven't peaked popularity yet. There are the Paul Newmans, which everyone is on the hunt for, literally. But I want to talk to you about watches that have more substance in that sense. Not that the Paul Newman doesn't, but something that's maybe not as hyped or has been underrated. Um, let's talk about one of those.
So I have a brand that I think many, many people have not discovered, but big collectors have discovered. It's a brand called Movado.
Mhm.
Most people know Movado from today. It's a company that still exists. It's actually in America. It's a Swiss company. It was started in Europe a long time ago, has a great history. In the 1960s, it merged with Zenith and became Zenith, Movado, and also Mondia was another brand. But let's just concentrate on Movado. Movado used a lot of the Zenith movements. They had their own movements, and actually Zenith used some of their movements because they had excellent movements as well. But they had a lot of crossover, but they kept themselves distinct. One of the most interesting things was that when they developed the El Primero in 1969 and released it to the world, it's still famous today, very sought after, especially vintage El Primeros. They're very expensive, hard to find. Movado released the exact same movement as the Datron, and they released it mostly to an American market. I don't know why, but Zenith wasn't as popular in America as Movado was. So they released it in America mostly as a Datron. The number of models, the quality was the same. The designs were sometimes the same as the Zenith. Sometimes they were different. There were overlaps. They even made triple date moon phase versions of the El Primero movement. Well, Zenith did too. They called it the Espada, and in the Movado language, it was called the Astronic. These watches are fantastic. Movado Datrons. They also made movements with the Zenith movements, the same ones you find in the Defy, but really interesting designs, a lot of bright colors. Movado was considered to be more of a, I want to say, like a style brand, a style design company. They wanted to be a little bit bolder. Their colors were brighter. They were a little less technical and maybe, I guess, industry oriented, like pilots and things like that. They wanted to be funky and fun. And you can find these watches, in my opinion, maybe for 20% of the price of an equivalent El Primero. So an excellent choice.
Okay, out of those watches, I have to say I'm a little surprised by your choice. That Movado was something I was not expecting as an underrated vintage timepiece, but that is some interesting piece of information out there.
It's a very old company. And unfortunately, what happened was that in the 70s, when Zenith started to fall apart, I mean, they were actually bought by the Zenith Corporation, which made TVs and things like that in America. And they shared a name, and they had nothing really to do with each other. They just fell under their umbrella. The Movado name was kind of kicked off at that time, and they sort of went off on their own, and they were bought by an American company who picked up essentially on one design, which was called the Museum Watch.
Yes.
It was an amazing watch, an amazing story, but unfortunately they just marketed the thing and sold it to death. And I mean by that, they just said, let's make as many as we can. Let's make as many different shapes and colors and everything, and we'll just sell this thing like crazy. And they didn't sell them for a lot of money. They were battery powered, so they were considered to be less high end than most. And Movado, unfortunately, has tried to capitalize a little bit on their history. They brought back the Datron and everything. It has nothing to do with the old one. I'm sure they're fine watches. I don't know what kind of movements they use. These vintage watches are amazing, and there's very little information out there. There was a book published in this, I think, the 80s, which you'll be able to see, and you can find it has very, very little about Movado from the 60s until the 80s, maybe 3 pages with 3 images. It's very, very brief. In fact, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of models that were made during that period that are incredible. And many of them were actual exact replicas of the Zenith watches. In fact, some of the manual chronographs and things like that.
It's interesting you use the word replica of Zenith chronographs. Given an option, putting aside maybe brand value and positioning, what would you consider? An El Primero in a Zenith or an El Primero in a Movado?
Well, personally, I love Movado, and I'll tell you why. They're much cheaper to buy, and and some of them, my opinion, there's one that I'm wearing right now. This one is what we call a panda dial. So it's white with the black subdials. And if I wear this on the street, people do think it's a Paul Newman. I mean, they don't know. How many people were wearing vintage Paul Newmans on the street? Nobody is. You'd be nuts to do that. It's just too much of an obvious thing. But this watch is actually the same size. And in my opinion, the Paul Newman Daytona has a Valjoux 72, which is a fine movement. It's fine. Millions and millions of watches had the Valjoux 72 movement in them, and they're great watches. Only this watch has the El Primero movement in it. It's called a Datron. The date is at the top at 12 instead of at 4, like a Zenith. But to me, this is a much better movement, and it's a very exclusive movement. I mean, it's a rare movement from 1970s. This is a great movement, and it's an automatic. So the Paul Newman original is a manual wind. So to me, this is a better watch. They had great bracelets. You can find them in all different kinds of conditions. And for me, having something that is truly rare, in my opinion, it's not about the money value, because these watches can be extremely rare and not that expensive. But why? Well, just because they're less well known. I mean, there isn't a lot of the marketing that goes into something like a Rolex. Rolex is the greatest company, in my opinion, in the world for marketing. They are, but bar none, they do the best marketing. They always have. They pioneered it, and they mastered it. And so everybody knows what a Rolex is, and that's great for them for business. They are not rare, in my opinion. Rolexes have never been rare, and they never will be rare. They're just a solid, good watch, but that's very well known. Which one? Oh, the Midas, yes. Well, they are rare, and there's some great stories. Right now they are, if you don't, I'm sure people know this if they're following the vintage market, they are very popular right now. They're very sought after. They're a Gerald Genta design.
Yes.
Okay, so you got he designed the pole router, the Speedmaster with the lugs, the lyre lugs. He's designed many watches. Obviously, the Patek Nautilus and the Royal Oak. But it's a great design. It's off center. It's sort of offset. And it was a very funny story. I'll just tell you if you don't know this one, but Elvis wore a Midas. He loved it. He thought it was great. He had a lot of watches. He loved watches, and he gave watches to people for fun. He actually gave them watches with his name engraved on the bezel, and that was their free entrance to any of his concerts or any of his events. But he wore a Midas, and he just liked it so much. He wore it, and he went swimming with it. Well, they're not waterproof. I mean, he went swimming with it. It's Elvis,
Yeah, I did. I do hear a lot of people talking about Rolex Midas right now, considering it is very rare, since most of them, what I've heard, have been melted. So what's left of the Midas is so I wouldn't say it's a underrated watch, but again, when it comes to Rolex, people are generally all about Paul Newman. So it's one of the newer ones in that sense that has popped up in the vintage watch market.
Well, what's interesting to me about Rolex, I love Rolex. I have Rolexes. My first vintage watch, it was a Rolex actually. It was a Explorer 1016, very nice, great watch, really nice to wear. But what's interesting about Rolex is really they just like found their niche and they stayed there.
Mhm.
And when you say to yourself, people say, "Oh, we talked about this before." When you talk about neo vintage, you say, "Oh, well, that's not a vintage. This is a vintage, and this is a heritage model. This is a reproduction." Well, you know, the Submariner that they make today doesn't look that different than one that they made in the 1950s. Rolex, that's a that's what they do, and they do it very well, and they're very reliable, great movements, great finishing and everything. So my opinion is there's nothing, I would never say anything bad. What they have tried to do is to they have a Cellini line, very cool. They have different watches that they've made in the past. I mean, obviously the bubble backs are very popular and it's a special kind of niche, but they are very great and they're fun to collect. But if you stay down the middle and you want to do the popular, it's going to be very, very expensive. You're going to be competing with a lot of people, and more people, more interest, prices go up. That's why I brought up Movado.
Mhm.
Why? Well, most people know this. I think let's talk about Rolex and the El Primero movement. Most people know that when the Rolex made their Daytona automatic chronograph they went and they started using Zenith El Primero movements. For the first 10 or some years, all the movements in the Rolex Daytona were made by Zenith for Rolex. That
I knew. Movado,
Yeah,
I was
and
not
and so you say, well, if you want, you could have a real Zenith,
aware.
or you could have a Rolex branded Zenith. Like, it's up to you. It's really up to you. It's about style and things like that. And I don't see any quality difference at all. None. You know, they're both the same, but one is very different. And there are actual Zenith. Italian De Luca is a jeweler that made Zenith watches. They actually use the Daytona style, and they sold those watches with Zenith and El Primero, but they look like Daytonas. They're very hard to find. Even in solid gold, you can find them, but you can afford them. You can't afford a solid gold automatic Daytona. I mean, most people can't. Some people.
That's a very interesting piece of information. Like you mentioned, we all know the story of Zenith and El Primero and Rolex. But the fact that you can have an El Primero movement, and we've discussed this before, that Zenith is one of the few brands that's not known particularly for their watches, but more for their movement, which is very rare. There are very few brands are like that. So it's not like a Royal Oak or it's not like a Nautilus. It's more like the El Primero movement. And to
Yes.
understand that you can get that in a
Yes.
Movado was very interesting.
And very, very inexpensively. And if you like to be a unique individual, if you like to put yourself out there and be that person who's not going to wear the same thing as everybody else, and you could have 3 or 4 watches for the same price as the one watch that everybody else is wearing, well, there's a premium for that, I think. And I think that appeals to certain people. You know, they're gonna want to know that,
Great.
that you
That
can
was
do that.
fantastic. Super
Yeah.
piece of information, Greg. Very, very unexpected. But thank you for that. And we'll see you again in our next video. Guys, if you want any more information on the Movado that Greg has so kindly shared with us, head on over to thehourmarkers.com and read more about it. Thank you, Greg. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.